This is the Demystifying Mental Toughness podcast, hosted by David Charlton, and you're listening to this podcast to help you build your own mental toughness, or so that you can support other people or your clients better. Either way, you will learn more about developing this plastic personality trait that all but guarantees that you will perform better and lead a more prosperous life. Welcome back to the Demystifying Mental Toughness podcast with your host, David Charlton. So today's topic is going to be mental health. It's something which over the last decade has become more and more of a talking point, with many elite athletes and coaches openly talking about their personal challenges and struggles. Yet, do clubs and organisations take their needs seriously? I'd argue in some cases, maybe not, though thankfully it is changing for the better. Today's guest is well qualified in this area. Paul Gorczynski and I go on to discuss this topic, where he talks about mental health, his research in the development and the implementation of mental health literacy strategies. He also goes on to share some great advice for decision makers in organizations, as well as some useful ideas for sport and exercise psychologists who have an interest in mental health. Enjoy tuning in. Hi, Paul. It's nice to meet you. Would you be able to explain to the listeners a little bit about your background and your interest in mental health and sport?
Well, thanks for having me, David. So my name is Paul Gorczynski. I am a chartered and registered practitioner psychologist with the BPS as well as the HCPC in the UK. I'm also a senior lecturer in sport and exercise psychology at the University of Greenwich. So my interest in mental health started many years ago, initially in London, Ontario, Canada, where I was doing a master's looking at physical activity and health of young people, looking at it through a counseling style program called coactive coaching. And the kind of interest in counseling and work with young people led me to do a PhD at the University of Toronto, where I was doing a lot of work on physical activity, on health with individuals living with schizophrenia. And it was during this time, as well as a little bit afterwards, working at the Center for Addiction and Mental Health, where I became quite interested within the general concept of health literacy, of mental health literacy, of how individuals obtained information, what they did with that information, the kind of processes that were involved with that information, and ultimately how it led to differences in their health. But I was looking at various other aspects other than mental health. I was interested in physical activity. I was interested in medication use, medication adherence, diet, and I just started to apply it to mental health, especially when I moved to the UK. And I did a bit of work before getting involved in a greater capacity with the consensus statement for the IOC, the consensus statement on mental health. So my interest grew from a master's to a PhD, a postdoc, looking at various aspects of the way that people use information, and in particular, how information on mental health structured people's decisions around seeking support. And today I work in that area primarily with organizations, with individuals, as well as something that I teach on as well.
Fantastic. Do you want to just elaborate a little bit more on the work with the IOC initially?
Yeah. I was invited by Claudia Reardon and Brian Hainline, who were heading up the consensus statement. I was the depression and suicide lead, as well as psychosis co-lead, working with Alan Curry on that. That was a wonderful experience. It was a very rewarding a project where we collectively took a look at the literature that had been accumulating around the mental health of elite athletes and what could be used to help improve diagnosis, treatment, but as well as shifting the kind of sport cultures around individuals' literacy, around making sure that there were action plans in place. In a sense, it was helping design a new generation of research as well as treatment, just overall shifting the conversation around mental health within elite sport. And today, I think it's done a tremendous job, especially in the last, it's been about 5 years now, 4 or 5 years since that statement, of really raising the importance of talking about one's mental health, how it impacts performance, but also what happens outside of sport. One of the neat things about that consensus statement is that it did recognize that athletes have lives outside of sport, and taking more holistic types of approaches is something that's really required. And we focus on sports so much, but what about after sport, or before sport, or even during sport? So I think it was a wonderful experience working with folks at the IOC. It certainly had a lot of opportunities that have come out afterwards for research, for education, for really just spreading the message around mental health.
Yeah. And obviously you talked there about schizophrenia and various different conditions around mental health. Is your background slightly different to the normal routes into sports psychology? Are you, is it like clinical or counseling background? How's it work?
My background was doing a master's of kinesiology first at Western University, or the University of Western Ontario, as it used to be known. And so I was working on a particular model of coaching, and I was working collaboratively with clients on their own specific goals and desires, and strategies for moving forward on achieving their goals. And that kind of interest led me to continue on with various approaches of working with people. My doctorate was within exercise science, and it predominantly focused around individuals living with schizophrenia. But it was really focused on exercise specifically, and strategies to address obesity within the population. A lot of that work focused around the environment. So I took a very socio-ecological approach to designing my research projects, and there were environmental interventions. There were explorations of eating behavior within that environment. This was a psychiatric hospital in Toronto. A lot of my work also focused on designing individual counseling interventions, brief counseling interventions that could be designed and delivered quite easily. Some advocacy work in terms of looking at stair use within psychiatric hospitals and whether they could be opened. Information processing around information availability for physical activity. And so my training really was from an early point in physical activity and kinesiology and exercise science, but with the unique opportunity of working within a psychiatric setting. And then my postdoc followed up on that work and looked at other interventions specifically within psychosis, more focused in terms of diabetes education, cardiovascular disease. But that was really my initial beginning in the field.
Sounds like, and obviously we touched on this prior to starting the call, that you've sort of taken the bull by the horns and really thrown yourself into like different environments and pushed yourself there. I'm just wondering what your advice would be to the trainee sports psychologist who goes through the traditional route in the UK here with the degree in psychology, the masters in sport and exercise psychology, and then they goes through the CPAR process, and they have a large interest in mental health. Yeah, well, what advice would you offer them?
Well, there is a lot of opportunity. I think within the UK, I think internationally. And part of my advice would be to look for those kinds of opportunities in a very non-linear manner. In a sense, look at the competencies you do have. Where can you work with people? And it's literally breaking down what you know, the kinds of skills you have, the kinds of experiences you have. But look for opportunities. There are opportunities aplenty. You're not only limited, I think, to a sports environment or a sports culture or an exercise culture. I think folks who are especially on the training route to become sports and exercise psychologists within performance, there are so many different opportunities, especially if it's with regards to mental health as well. So there's opportunities to work with individuals to do needs analyses around organizations, what kinds of processes are in place within those organizations to help individuals around their mental health. It's also recognizing the limits of what you know. So there are clear guidelines in terms of when an individual needs to refer to a registered mental health professional. But providing information around mental health, certainly working within the areas of mental health literacy, working within the areas of organizational health literacy. These are all things that sport, exercise, performance psychologists are able to really work in and thrive. And so I really just encourage individuals to think as broadly about their competencies, their skills, how they work collaboratively with other individuals and other professions as well. That's something that I do a great deal. I try to make as many friends as possible, especially in diverse professions. It's something that's incredibly rewarding to just work with all sorts of individuals. But think in a non-linear way. You're not just limited to applied sport or exercise work. Think where else you may be able to apply your skills. We don't have enough time, David, to list all of these things, but I think it's actually something that should be rooted in critical self-reflection. What is it that the individual wants out of their practice? What are their skills? What does this mean? And then, kind of, now what? What am I going to do with this? Where am I going to go with this? And there's plenty of directions to go in.
And in terms of mental health literacy, obviously you've done a lot of research in this field. Am I right? This is about obtaining understanding and like the use of the basic information. Is that generally the gist of mental health literacy?
For some individuals, I think that's kind of where it starts and where it ends. And I think sometimes some of the criticism that exists around mental health literacy is that it's just rooted in this kind of information. But that's a very complicated process. Mental health literacy has its history within health literacy, and it's kind of going back to people being able to read and understand prescriptions or simple pamphlets in order to change their health behaviors. But mental health literacy is evolving, and I would say evolving very quickly in terms of how individuals are able to find information, how they are able to process information, how they are able to understand information, how they are able to use it. And it not only is associated with seeking support, but it's also about challenging self and public stigma around mental health, how we feel and how others may feel about individuals living with mental health symptoms and disorders. But it's also quite strongly nowadays tied with organizational health literacy. So what are organizations doing to be able to provide information around health, or specifically in this instance, mental health, to ease that process of not only finding, using information to change health behaviors or to seek out services. And organizations have a tremendous responsibility in simplifying that process. And so mental health literacy traditionally evolved in that kind of manner that followed very, very closely to health literacy. And it was about kind of finding, using information, challenging stigma, helping with help seeking, but it's evolving. It's evolving to take on the need to understand various cultures and the context that people find themselves in, how individuals use that information, how is the organization structured, what services and support mechanisms are actually available. It's all fine and dandy to offer individuals information, but if it stops there, people don't have access to mental health services, or the wait lists are too long, or there's just literally nothing available. I mean, it becomes quite useless at that point. Frustrating, if anything. But it's evolving, and it's evolving rather quickly. There's a lot of work that's being done in the area to see how it can be improved, and I think a lot of organizations are taking it more seriously than perhaps maybe in the past.
So what advice would you offer for people who are decision makers in organizations there who've got this on their agenda?
Who have mental health literacy on the agenda?
Yeah.
Well, I think what is important is to really understand the kinds of organizations we're talking about. So how does this fit in with something like their overall values or their mission or the overall goals of the organization? So if we're talking about, say, maybe a league or a sporting organization, then I think it's important to understand that becoming literate in mental health is not something that happens overnight. This is a process. And that training really needs to start early, certainly at a young age appropriate, language appropriate, stage of development appropriate. Needs to be ongoing. It's not something that is just done once. It needs to be revisited constantly. And both, there needs to be a concerted effort to help individuals find information, use that information, but situate it somewhere. So I think with anything, that organization has to take a look at within itself. How does it actually organize strategies for information processing? How does it actually offer opportunities to seek support? What is in itself doing to challenge mental stigma that exists within the organization? What kinds of other challenges exist that may threaten individuals' mental health? So it's, in a sense, something that needs to be taken into a broader SWOT analysis of that organization. And that mental health literacy is something that needs to be designed collectively for all individuals within an organization. It's not just enough to, say, maybe focus on the athletes, or perhaps maybe a coaching staff, or some select few, but overall everyone becomes more literate within mental health. But it starts with a good understanding of what kind of organization we're talking about, exactly what are its goals, values, what's the context like, what's the history like, what are some prior challenges that perhaps maybe we are working with, but to understanding the organization and moving from there.
Yeah, certainly for any clubs and organizations out there who haven't really delved into this area too much, it sounds like actually that there's a full-time job there for someone quite easily if you're going to do it at a really professional level.
Yeah, but I think that goes back to the values and goals of the organization. Why is this important? What do they want? Do they know how to direct people to seek support? Are they interested in ultimately shifting the culture of the organization as well? And if not, then I think everything can be tapered back with an appropriate action plan that takes into consideration the resources that an organization does have available. Because you're right, it can be something like a full-time job of looking after the mental health of an organization, or you can perhaps outsource that. And so it's really understanding the organization, its resources, and ultimately what they wish to do.
I'm aware of time, obviously, with us packing up shortly. The name of the podcast is called Demystifying Mental Toughness. Can you just summarize where you feel like mental toughness and mental health sort of collide, or if they don't in your mind?
I don't think they really do. I have this view that mentally tough means that we almost have to sacrifice our mental health. Mental health really speaks to individuals being able to cope with stress, realize their abilities, learn to kind of work in a way that fulfills their ambitions as well as contribute meaningfully to a community. And I think sometimes mental toughness is to do things that goes against one's kind of wishes, one's abilities to realize their potential. Maybe it's almost like sacrificing themselves somehow to be tough. I'm not even sure what tough really means in this instance, but I really struggle with the term mental toughness. Mostly because I think it doesn't allow individuals to be kind to themselves, to acknowledge that some things will just be stressful. But I think it's, I really struggle with the term mental toughness. I struggle with it because it doesn't recognize that we need to just be kind to ourselves, to each other and to ourselves, and to allow ourselves just to kind of sometimes just deal with the stresses we have in life. That's a terrible answer to your question. Hopefully you can do something with that.
Yeah, no, I'm sure I can do. I know when I think back to what some people think mental toughness is sort of getting your head down, like gritting your teeth and you're like going through things. But ultimately, if we're all going to have challenges in our lives at different points. As you say, the whole kindness piece and self-care is so important in order to be able to then, if you're an athlete, say, focus and perform at your best. We could probably do a whole podcast on that. So we'll leave it at that for now.
Self-care is certainly something that's very important, especially not only for, oftentimes the people that sports and exercise performance psychologists work with, but also self-care within the profession. It's ever so important to just recognize where you are at and to be kind to yourself.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. So on the mental health literacy, and we'll think about organizations in this respect, what would your 3 key takeaways from our conversation be?
I think the most important thing you can really do is to do a thorough needs analysis, understand what are the needs of the individuals, what are the needs of the organization, be able to kind of fully take into consideration the goals and the values of the organization. So do a thorough needs analysis. I would say the second thing is to be able to work with existing literature and research, and so that any kinds of interventions are provided in an evidence-based and practical manner that recognizes the values, the goals of the organization, the individuals involved, and the resources available. And then really rely on the way that you communicate with people. How is it that you actually disseminate the kind of information, especially around mental health, that are needed by individuals or by organizations? So a solid needs analysis, ability to use research and available literature, and then be able to communicate that in a clear manner.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Yeah, thank you. In terms of your contact information, if people wanted to reach out to you and find out more about your work, where can they find you?
They can find my contact information on the University of Greenwich by profile page. Do not reach out to me on Twitter because I won't respond to you. I never check that. But they can send me an email.
Brilliant. I'll put your email address in the show notes. And a big thank you for your time today, Paul. What I found really interesting from the conversation with Paul was the complexities around developing and implementing mental health literacy strategies at an organizational level. Many clubs and organizations, especially in sport, have decision makers who lack education in this area. They may see the area as a bit of a tick box and have an old-fashioned stance on mental health, and dare I say it, an old-fashioned stance and an old-fashioned view on what mental toughness is too. So I'm hoping that this short introduction to Paul's work is helpful in this instance. Paul sadly was unwell on recording this, so we had to keep the episode shorter than normal. However, you may find that he's a guest again in the near future. You're going to certainly find a host of resources in the show notes, from webinars he's done to short courses and research angles and research articles, which will be very, very helpful to you. Feel free to have a good look at them in what is an increasingly important area. You may also want to sign up to the Mental Edge, where we share evidence-based strategies to enhance your knowledge too in this area, as well as focusing a lot on helping individuals and teams to optimize their chances of reaching their full potential. Have a great week. If you enjoyed this episode of the Demystifying Mental Toughness podcast with David Charlton, do check out my website, sport-excellence.co.uk, and my online sport psychology resources. The Sport-Excellence website has essential resources for anyone looking to build their own mental toughness or the mental toughness of their athletes or teams, or if you want to achieve peak performance more often or optimal functioning. The Sport Excellence website has everything you need to keep moving forward and thrive. So go on, head over to sport-excellence.co.uk to find out more.